I'm Grant Walker. Welcome to Last Call for Wednesday the 20th of May, and I'll be back with Heads Up Thursday 10 a.m. To the banking sector, Bank of New Zealand has been losing out on its share of new mortgage business lately, its latest disclosure statement shows. Reserve Bank figures show the March quarter was a bumper 3 months for new mortgage lending, surging more than 37% from a year earlier. But BNZ's figures show it accounted for only 11% of new lending in the 3 months compared with its overall market share of about 16%. BNZ's mortgage book increased by $360 million in the 3 months ended March, taking the total to $31.3 billion. The bank's mortgage lending also grew by slightly less than its market share, accounting for below 15% of new lending in the December quarter. As with the other major banks, the amount of its lending to people with less than 20% equity in their homes continues to shrink, and it eased by $174 million in the latest quarter, while lending to those with more equity grew by $534 million. BNZ, which is owned by National Australia Bank, is the second bank to lodge its March quarter statement. Earlier this month, it reported a near 10% rise in first-half net profit to $502 million. In business news, Cavalier Corporation's managing director has quit in the wake of the carpet maker's sixth successive profit downgrade. Cavalier is now warning investors to expect a normalised annual profit at or below $1 million, down from the previous guidance of between $1 and $4 million. But the bottom line will be a loss after further asset write-downs compared with a net profit of $5.8 million in the year ended June 2014. It's the third time the carpet maker has downgraded its annual forecast for the current year after 3 downgrades last year. Colin McKenzie has stepped down from the top job and will be replaced temporarily by Chief Financial Officer Paul Alston. The company says earnings from its Australian broadloom carpet operations have been hurt by the strength of the New Zealand dollar against the Australian dollar since the beginning of this year. Cavalier says its transition plan for its Onterra tile business of supplementing its manufacturing with substantial imports has been slow to materialise and is only now starting to gain traction. It says the board has prepared an updated strategy and business plan, which has been reviewed by a specialist team from accounting firm Deloitte and which projects improved profitability in the year ending June 2016, as well as a substantial reduction in bank debt. The company expects to return to adequate levels of profitability by the year ending June 2017 by focusing on its core businesses. It says its bank is fully aware of these projections. As at 31st December, Cavalier's debt-to-equity ratio stood at 39%. Net debt stood at $59 million.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. One of Australia's largest broking firms, BBY, has gone into administration and has been suspended from trading on the ASX. Jenny Ruth has been looking at the situation. Jenny, I believe BBY has operations here in New Zealand.
Yes, it does, but it's relatively small. It's got offices in Auckland and Wellington and 12 personnel here. The local chief executive, Brent Wienink, says the local operations aren't part of the administration of the Australian firm. It appointed KPMG as administrators earlier this week. Reportedly, BBY has been trying to raise additional capital so that it can meet things like margin calls and satisfy the ASX's requirements. And reportedly it needed between 2 and 3 million Australian dollars, but it hasn't been able to raise that money.
Now, will this have an impact here in New Zealand, on its arm here?
Well, the New Zealand operators advisors only. They don't actually handle any cash, so there won't be any direct losses. Of course, they have been advising clients to put money offshore and through other brokers, but it's unclear at this point exactly how much of an impact it will have on their New Zealand clients.
Well, just looking at the Australian side of the ditch and the impact of this, ABC News is reporting that thousands of investors in Australia are bracing themselves for widespread losses. And what about third-party stockbrokers?
Well, yes. BBY was reportedly turning over 2.4 billion Australian dollars in ASX equities a month, and they're operating on behalf of many other third-party brokers who say that they're out of pocket for many millions of dollars. It's very early days. It'll take some time before we can see what the exact impact will be.
And what about the possible impact on their clients' funds?
Well, they said that they have more than $2 billion in assets under management. Not all of that will be transacted. So, it comes down to how much is actually in the middle of transactions and what happens to the money.
So they were founded in 1987. What's been their history since then?
Well, they've been very big in options trading, and incidentally there were signs that the group was running into trouble earlier this month. There was a notice went out from the executive chairman, a man called Glenn Rosewall, saying that they'd decided that part of the business was growing too quickly and they were facing a lot of financial pressure to make sure that their clients' exposures were properly covered. So I guess that was an early sign that the firm was headed for trouble.
Indeed. Well, let's just hope those investors' funds are safe. Thanks very much for that, Jenny.
NBR Radio with Bayleys, New Zealand's leading commercial real estate company.
In business news, NBR Rich Lister-owned Savage Group has acquired all shares in Christchurch-based Conrad Medical Systems. The investment group, owned by the Savage family, previously owned 50% of the medical software company, which has been operating in the radiology sector for over 25 years. Conrad, founded in 1987, operates in more than 400 practices in Australia and New Zealand and powers some of the largest radiology service providers in the world. The acquisition amount has not been disclosed, but will help fuel the company's expansion in the countries it operates. Savage Group Managing Director Catherine Savage says, "We take a long-term view of our investments and we like the markets Conrad is addressing." Founder Andrew Scott, who owned most of the 50% shares sold, will remain product director and says there are exciting new products ahead. He says Conrad remains focused on the delivery of outstanding functionality and ever-improving customer service. In parallel, we are developing strategies that we will be introducing progressively to our partners. Savage Group also owns industrial kitchen equipment provider Safco, which kits out the likes of the restaurant brands owned chains and Subway, and cleaning products business Waifatu Distributors, the largest supplier of janitorial and cleaning equipment in New Zealand. Savage Group patriarch Roy Savage originally made his fortune through industrial technology, including workplace safety equipment. In consumer news, Consumer New Zealand is calling on the public to lobby Qantas Airways Jetstar subsidiary to drop the use of pre-ticked boxes in its online booking forms that add extras to ticket prices some travellers may not want. The Consumer Rights Group has put a form letter on its website that Kiwis can use to email Jetstar Chief Executive David Hall, asking him to stop the practice. Consumer Chief Executive Sue Chetwynd said pre-ticked boxes risk misleading people into paying for extras they don't want. She said in a statement it takes a truly canny consumer to make their way through a Jetstar booking without having additional charges appear on the fare. Jetstar hasn't followed rival Air New Zealand, which scrapped a pre-selected travel insurance option in its online booking system after receiving a formal warning from the Commerce Commission. The regulator is cracking down on businesses misleading consumers with opt-out additional products online and wants them to use an opt-in approach when selling add-ons to avoid any possibility of breaching the Fair Trading Act. Ms. Chetwynd said the Jetstar booking process had pre-selected boxes for travel insurance, seats and baggage. On a return flight from Wellington to Auckland, the service charges would add $42.95 to the fare, and customers may also have to pay a credit card surcharge, she said.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. John Banks is now effectively acquitted, but will he run for mayor? Chris Keel joins me. What are his chances, Chris?
I think he probably is thinking about having a shot, but I think Kim.com's social media campaign, which he started last night, probably will damage his chances. I mean, a couple of our readers have pointed out that .com really campaigned against John Key during the election with his Moment of Truth event, and we saw how non-effective that was. But I think this is different because John Key did spend a period of time powling around with Kim.com before they fell out and over the donation controversy.
Yeah, but you just wonder if Kim.com has still got the necessary grunt in terms of his reputation to actually do John Banks any harm.
No, certainly. I mean, he managed to get his tweet, which was reiterating the original charges against Banks and how .com sees them. He's saying, I offered $50,000, he asked for 2 cheques, to keep it anonymous, I signed 2 cheques, he knew I donated, etc., etc. But to me, it just serves as a reminder of that period where Banks was going out to .com Mansion and lunches and parties there. And I can't really think of any good explanation of why he would do that. I can certainly think of a bad one, which is a candidate is greedy for donations and .com is trying to curry political favour at the time he's trying to buy his house and trying to get New Zealand citizenship. But yeah, it's hard to think of a good explanation. It does seem like a real lapse of judgment.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if you thought that. Now, would Banks, do you think, go back to his home base in the ACT Party?
It just doesn't seem like they want him. David Seymour was in the media this morning, and he was repeatedly pushed on the question of whether John Banks could be taken back as a candidate, and he said, I don't see him being a candidate. He'll always be a friend of the party. And even in terms of when he was asked to endorse Banks as a mayoral candidate, which seems like a reasonably soft question, he even avoided that and said, let's give anyone who wants to run some encouragement. So it was really, it seemed like ACT is still holding Banks at arm's length and still treating him like damaged goods, and I think that's probably going to be more harmful to his mayoral prospects than whatever .com says online.
Of course, if he wants to campaign for mayor, that costs money, and he's saying this court case has done him a lot of financial harm. Is that true?
Oh, definitely. Any high court case costs a lot of money. And of course, last time when John Banks went looking for donations and he approached Sky City and various high net worth individuals like .com, it's blown up in the media. So when he goes to potential corporate and individual sponsors next time around, they'll definitely maybe be a bit more wary about the media aftermath. And of course, the disclosure laws around donations have been tightened up in the meantime.
Indeed they have. Chris, thanks very much for that.
NBR
Radio.
Free to air online. NBR, the meeting place of intelligent business.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. Well, yesterday John Banks was acquitted of knowingly filing a false electoral return. To discuss the political and legal ramifications of this court case, we have former ACT Party member and President John Boscawen in the studio here in Auckland. Victoria University Legal Ethics lecturer Gary Forrester is joining us on the line from Wellington, and Otago University law professor Andrew Geddes is joining us from Dunedin. Gentlemen, the Crown couldn't find Mr. Banks guilty of the crime, but are there moral or political questions he still has to answer about his behaviour? Gary?
I believe there are. I believe that's fair game. And I noticed on Radio National, Guyan Espiner asked some questions about that. And the questions are simply this. Did he know at the time of filing those documents that he had received the donations from Kim.com? That's never been adjudicated. Mr. Banks declined to answer those questions, but I think they're fair questions to put to him still.
John Boscawen, what are your thoughts?
Look, he's been cleared. He's been acquitted by 3 appeal court judges. He had the option of doing what Len Brown did, which was to set up a secret trust to run all of his funds through that secret trust, and then just simply declare one donation from that trust to the mayoral campaign. John set up his fundraising campaign as he has done over many campaigns, because he's been in public office for over 35 years, and he deliberately set the fundraising side, which he was doing, distinct from the bookkeeping side, and it was the bookkeepers who prepared the return. Had he really sought out to hide things, he would have simply done what Len Brown did, which was to set up a trust. Now, that's now no longer legal, but it certainly was at the time.
So why do you think he didn't?
I think he wanted to be transparent. I think he wanted to show people just how many people supported him, because he filed the number of donations, the size of the donations, and I think he thought it was the moral thing to do, to prepare the return in the way that he did it. But probably with the benefit of hindsight, he probably wishes he'd taken the Len Brown route, which was perfectly legal at the time.
Yeah. Now, Andrew Geddes, any thoughts from you on this?
I do take John's point that he had the option of setting up the trust as Brown did. The problem is he didn't do that. He did go down this route where he was required to declare donations from people over $1,000 where he knew the source. And the problem is he didn't do it. I mean, he handed in a return that was false, and that was found in the High Court. That's not touched on by anything of Kim.com. The falsity was with regard a $15,000 donation from Sky City. Now, the question is, did he know the return was false? And all along, I thought he probably didn't. I think he just lost the campaign, lost interest, and signed something and then handed it in. Whereas it strikes me that there's no real reason why he would knowingly hand in a false return for a campaign that he just lost. I mean, it just doesn't make any sense.
But do you think the Court of Appeal was legally correct in its effective acquittal of Mr. Banks?
Oh, absolutely, yeah. Now, once Kim.com started changing his story based on this new evidence, the reason why the High Court found him guilty just turned into mist. There was no reason he should have been found guilty.
Now, one of the findings from the Court of Appeal was that Crown Law had misled the court. So what are the legal consequences of this finding, Gary?
Well, it's a serious matter, of course, to mislead the court, but I note that the Court of Appeal was very careful. They said that the effect of the Crown's handling of these documents, this change of story by Kim.com, the effect was to mislead the court, but they described it as an error of judgment, not misconduct. That doesn't quite end the matter, though, because under the rules of conduct and client care in New Zealand, there are charges that could be brought in addition to misconduct. You could have charges brought that relate to negligence or incompetence, and such things as this could conceivably fall under those categories. It would be up to somebody whether they wanted to pursue that with the disciplinary committee of the Law Council or not. But those would be theoretically open, even though professional misconduct is not suggested by the Court of Appeal.
Nevertheless, it was Crown Law, a heavy hitter, which has been found to have misled the court. What are your thoughts on that, Andrew?
Yeah, it's a terrible look. I mean, it just, well, two things. A, it's terrible in practice that the court was unable to find what the proper legal outcome should have been in the first Court of Appeal hearing. I mean, courts ought to have the evidence they need in order to reach the right legal outcome, and they just didn't have it, and that's bad in itself. But also, it just, looks terrible when you've got the state, the Crown, which has, all the cards when it comes to prosecutions in its hand, not plain and fairly. And that's essentially what this is. I mean, it had a card in its hand that it hid from the defence. And real questions do have to be asked about how that came to happen. So that aspect of this isn't over, I'm sure.
Now, John, what are your thoughts on that?
Well, let me first come back to Andrew's comments. You said a short time ago, Andrew, that John Banks filed a false return and he knew it. He didn't actually know it.
No, I said he filed a false return. I didn't say he knew it.
Okay, well, I stand corrected and I apologise, but I thought I heard you say that he knew he was filing a false return because... No.
I right from the start, I thought he didn't know because it just struck me as just deeply implausible he'd do that. There's no reason for him to have knowingly done so.
Absolutely, and he relied on others who had worked on many campaigns previously.
Look, I do have to point out that candidates aren't allowed to rely in that way. If you put your signature on the bottom of it, you are liable for the contents of it. And the fact he didn't read it, I do think he does have to bear some responsibility for that fact. Not in a legal sense, nothing can be done to him about it, but, he did bring a bit of this onto himself. Yeah,
but he relied on the assurances of his treasurer that it was correct, and it was the treasurer who processed the bank statements and the payments. And John said, I think in the tape of his police prosecution interview, that he'd never seen a bank statement from the very beginning. But look, coming to the role of the Crown, I think their behaviour has been disgraceful. I think on 2 points. I think the point of Mr. Dacre QC, who was hired by the Crown to prosecute this case. Clearly it was Dacre's decision not to present this evidence. It's a material major error on Dacre's point, and I think it's disgraceful. Having said that, Dacre is employed by Mike Heron, the Solicitor General. The Solicitor General is, I understand it, the top lawyer in New Zealand. He represents you and I. He represents the people of New Zealand. Now, he should have turned up in the second appeal court, he should have said, my agent, my contractor, my QC has made a mistake. I apologise for that mistake and we're not going to pursue this further. But he didn't. He turned up in court and he justified the behaviour of Mr Dacre. He, for the second time, opposed the appeal, and the 3 appeal court judges have said this is a serious miscarriage of justice. If the Solicitor General, if our top lawyer can't recognise what is a serious miscarriage of justice, I don't think he's competent for the job. I actually think he should stand down. I agree with John Banks on this. How could someone... It's understandable a person employ staff make a mistake, and essentially Dacre made a mistake. And that's a separate issue for Mr Dacre and the New Zealand Law Society. But for his boss, the Solicitor General, to come along and actually support Mr Dacre's behaviour, I thought was disgraceful.
Now, we are discussing the acquittal, or the effective acquittal of John Banks yesterday, and my panel consists of John Boscawen, a former ACT MP, and also the legal ethics lecturer at Victoria, Gary Forrester, and Otago University law professor Andrew Geddes is also on the panel. Now, gentlemen, our 2 legal academics, what's your reaction to Mr Boscawen's claim that this was disgraceful behaviour by the Crown?
Well, I'd agree with John that it's certainly a very bad look. I think Andrew made the same point. It shouldn't have happened, and it's a serious matter. There's no doubt about that. As to what should come out of that, that's really not for me to say. I suppose the Attorney General will look at it. He said he was talking it over with Crown Law. He'll make a decision as to ways forward. Mr. Banks may wish to consider his options. Clearly, something bad has happened in the courts, and the Solicitor General does have to bear that responsibility, in my view.
Yeah, I'm just following through on that. Andrew, do you think that someone from Crown Law could lose their job?
Well, look, put it this way, I think there'll be a lot of nervousness within Crown Law, because when the Court of Appeal is saying that you have misled the court, that's as bad as it gets. The one thing I will say is that Chris Finlayson is a real straight shooter, and he likes good process, and he is going to be very unhappy that this happened, not directly under his watch, because he quite rightly keeps out of criminal affairs, but the fact that people under him have done this is something he's just not going to be happy about at all. So in terms of getting it put right or vesting consequences on people, I have a great deal of faith that he will follow through on that.
I hope you're right, Andrew.
Yeah, well, I guess we just have to wait and see. One thing I will say is that when you get into trials, they become a little bit like warfare, and a fog of war envelops people. And they start making decisions in the heat of trials or involved in trials that really they probably shouldn't, because it gets so adversarial. And I think perhaps what's happened here is that there was a little bit of losing sight of the greater ethics and the greater requirement to serve the court, and a little bit of, God damn it, we're just not going to lose this one. And, that's probably not a good thing for the Crown to have done.
Now, what do you think?
That's true, Andrew, but
I'm sorry.
I think you'd be the first to agree the Crown it touts itself as a model litigant. It's required to be a model litigant. And certainly it failed in that standard quite abysmally.
Yes, that goes without saying.
Now, John, what do you think about the idea of compensation for John Banks?
Look, Mr Banks was asked about this yesterday, and I certainly don't speak for him, and he said he'd be considering his options. Well, of course you would expect compensation, but there are some things that Mr Banks can't be compensated for. He spent literally hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars on his legal team. And yes, that can be reimbursed to Mr Banks. He still has to go to court to fight for it, and I suspect the Crown will probably fight and argue over reimbursing him his costs. But there are some things, like I say, that can't be reimbursed. He had to go through the ignominy of being placed in the dock, the judge saying to him, the media may take a photograph of the prisoner now. He had his wife called a liar. His own, I know, having spent quite a bit of time with John during his various trials, that he's incredibly proud of his children, and he's very, very upset that the toll that this has taken on his wife and his family. And he will never be compensated for this. However, he can be put, in part in the same financial position. But bear in mind that when this when this thing was first stepped down for trial, he resigned as a Minister of the Crown. He remained a Member of Parliament, but he resigned as a Minister. His ministerial staff lost their jobs. He had to move out of his ministerial office. And then subsequently, when he was convicted on the evidence of Mr. Mona.com and the security guard, he resigned as a Member of Parliament. The people of Epsom didn't actually have their Member of Parliament for 5 months prior to the last election. So some things you simply cannot compensate for.
What are your thoughts briefly, Andrew?
I think he's got a very good case for getting his costs for the second Court of Appeal hearing. I mean, there shouldn't have had to be a second Court of Appeal hearing. I think he's probably got a reasonably strong claim for costs for the first Court of Appeal hearing, because if the right evidence had been put forward, he'd have been acquitted at that. Beyond that, well, he's absorbed the costs that anyone who gets accused of a crime has to absorb. That's the way our system works. And, you know, unfortunately, there's hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of people a year go through the same thing as Mr. Banks did.
Now, finally and very briefly, Gary, do you think he can rebuild his political career?
That will be difficult. That's like the other things that John and Andrew have been talking about. That, of course, turns on Mr. Banks's feelings and wishes going forward. I will say this. It's very important that we all remember he has been effectively acquitted, as you put it, John.
Yeah.
But he has not been exonerated. There's a big difference between the two.
Indeed there is. Thoughts from you, Andrew, on his future, possibly political career?
Well, I mean, no one's ever out until they're down and out. Whether he'd want to get back in the game is another question. You know, he's taken a lot of punishment, as John has quite rightly said, over the last few years, and whether you really want to get back on the horse after that, I just don't know.
What are your thoughts, John? Do you reckon he can go back on the hustings?
I haven't actually discussed that with John, but he was asked that question yesterday at the press conference, and he said, look, those decisions are far too early in the piece. He's thinking about that for another day. And, of course, what format that would take, whether it be at a national or local level, who would know. But I think if you ask John that question in 2 or 3 months' time, you'd probably get a better answer.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see if he does put his hand up for the mayoralty at least, if not Parliament. Well, gentlemen, thank you very much, for that was a very lively and interesting discussion. NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. With me on the phone from Pukekohe is John Banks, who was effectively acquitted by the Court of Appeal yesterday. John, you were pretty emotional when you fronted up to the media yesterday. How do you feel now?
Well, I was emotional because the jihad was over. The torture by installment, the oppression, the vindictiveness, the nastiness, and the daily grind of living with the fear of going to jail was finally over. I knew it would happen, but not quite when. And I knew when we got to the Court of Appeal, given the new evidence, the secret, hidden evidence from the Crown, that we'd get over the line. And so today I feel somewhat surreal. I'm glad that this instalment is over, but there needs to be change, and there needs to be much redress.
What sort of change, John?
Well, I think it's outrageous in this country that you have a politically appointed Solicitor General calling the shots against a Member of Parliament in criminal proceedings. Whereas, as you know, in Australia, they have moved towards an independent office of prosecution. And that needs to be an arm's length opportunity between the executive and political appointments and the prosecutory roles of the state. So this is a Trojan horse. I don't think it's the end. I only think it's the beginning. But let me place on record on NBR Radio this afternoon what the Solicitor General and his crony, Paul Dacre QC, got up to, in my case, was outrageous. Not just outrageous, but wrong. Very wrong. Unethical, shonky, wrong, and vindictive. They went to the Court of Appeal in October with explosive evidence that would have seen me acquitted in October. The Court of Appeal ruled yesterday that I would have been acquitted in October if they had have seen the evidence that the Crown decided they would cheat me with.
Well,
and they didn't produce it for the court.
Bearing in mind what you've just said, John, do you want compensation?
Oh, how can you compensate? How can you get compensation, and how can you get redress when a High Court judge in the form of Wiley J. in Auckland refers to your much-loved wife as an unreliable witness? The most reliable, honest, professional woman in New Zealand, Amanda Banks, referred to by a High Court judge as basically a liar. How can you compensate for that? There's no money. There's no money that can compensate for that. There's no money that can compensate for me standing in the dock and being threatened with jail. There is no money for me being accused and referred to as the prisoner. There is no money for the disgust and the obscenity of the process that I've been dragged through.
How much did this all cost you, John, from
I haven't
go
counted.
to woe?
I haven't counted. It would be staggering, as it would be indeed frightening. I haven't counted. All I know is you don't get the legal representation, the first-class legal representation I've had from David Jones QC and others. If I didn't have the resources, if I didn't have the resilience, if I didn't have the family, and if I didn't have the courage, I would have been burnt at the stake, which no doubt, under this Solicitor General and his tutelage, happens every day of the week. There's something systemically wrong with Wellington, with the Solicitor General's office, in the way that they have behaved over me. If they behave this way with me, how the hell do you think they treat the ordinary, average Joe Blow? I would think very, very poorly and with a lot of contempt.
What do you want from Crown Law, who withheld that evidence in your favour?
I want this man to stand aside today until a full investigation is done as to his personal culpability and that of his office in deciding to cheat me at the Court of Appeal on the first appearance in October last year, to deny the Court of Appeal the opportunity to see evidence which completely dismantled the Crown case against me at trial, completely discredited and dismantled the Crown case against me. I want to see that dealt with. This joker Dacre in Auckland, Dacre QC, he needs to be stripped. He needs to be stripped of his silk, that is the title of Queen's Counsel, and he needs to pay back the hundreds and hundreds of thousands of dollars funded by the taxpayers to persecute me after he knew there was no case for me to answer. No case for me to answer.
John, very direct question, which everybody's asking. Are you going to go for the mayoralty?
Well, I don't have time to think about that right now. I'm catching my breath. There's plenty of time to think about the future because we need to deal with what's happened in the past in the best interests of the judicial system and our open democracy for the future. That's what I'm focusing on at the moment.
People say, while technically you got off, you still have ethical questions to answer surrounding your meetings with Kim.com and the donations. What do you have to say about that?
You probably have ethical questions to answer about interviewing me. I mean, it's no difference. I mean, but I mean, this is BS. The Court of Appeal has been through every single little skerrick of information, half-truth, lies, BS, and everything else that's gone with this case. The judges from the Court of Appeal have been through every single minutiae of evidence, and I have been completely vindicated. Completely vindicated.
Do you regret, though, when you look back, that you visited the .com mansion?
I have no regrets. I don't live with regrets. If you live with regrets, you have no future. I have no regrets. What has been done has happened.
Indeed, it has. Well, we'll leave it there, but thanks very much for giving us your time today, John Banks.
NBR Radio. With Clooney Restaurant now offering Auckland's most exclusive private dining room. NBR Radio.
To local government and money. The local government funding agency New Zealand Council's lender now boasts the country's second longest bond term as the sector moves to a 30-year infrastructure planning regime. LGFA Chief Executive Mark Butcher told media at the Local Government New Zealand's quarterly briefing LGFA now offers a 12-year bond due in 2027 to its member council, which is second only to a Transpower bond due in 2028. Councils are now extending the term of their debt to 7 or 8 years compared to around 5 years in 2011. Councils have shifted to 30-year infrastructure strategies required under amendments to the Local Government Act to better understand how infrastructure will be renewed and get a clear outlook on funding for the renewal. The country's councils have $120 billion in assets, some of which are coming to the end of their lifetime and are due for either renewal or replacement. Last year, LGNZ's Three Waters project, the first national picture ever published of New Zealand's water assets, found a quarter of the $35.7 billion of water, wastewater and stormwater infrastructure is more than 50 years old, and up to 20% needs renewal or is unserviceable. Local authorities own and are responsible for the water infrastructure and will foot the bill for upgrades to the assets. LGNZ expects to make recommendations on the next step, including on expected costs and how to finance upgrades in the middle of the year. In February 2012, local authorities established the Local Government Funding Agency, creating a borrowing entity with sufficient size to bring down the credit costs of individual councils. LGFA issued $280 million in the March quarter, below its average quarterly issuance of $379 million, and now has $4.83 billion of debt issued. Mr Butcher said the drop in first quarter borrowing is probably seasonal, with most councils working on infrastructure over the summer and then borrowing in the June and September quarter to pay for work. He said LGFA was seeing borrowing to refinance existing debt. The lender was also seeing interest from overseas investors attracted to the relatively high yields and safe haven assets of New Zealand in a globally low interest rate environment, and also more investment from KiwiSaver funds. In the quarter, LGFA issued $10 million in bonds due in 2017, $10 million due in 2019, $40 million due in 2020, $30 million due 2021, $90 million due 2023, and $100 million due in 2027. To local government, polling of some 3,000 members of the public and businesses scores local government poorly on 3 core measures of competence to give the sector a reputation score of 29 out of a possible 100, says the sector's national body Local Government NZ or LGNZ. Key findings of the Colmar Brunton research, which was undertaken in mid-2014 for the first time and will be repeated annually, sought views in a range of areas grouped into the categories of performance, local leadership and communication and interaction. The average score for performance, which covered factors such as value for money, financial management and ability to manage community affairs, came in at 28%, while local leadership scores averaged 26%. LGNZ Chairman Lawrence Yuill said the results aren't that flash, although the results were consistent with similar polling in Britain and Australia. LGNZ would be introducing a significant program over coming months to drive positive change. Among likely initiatives was to create a nationally agreed accord between the local government sector and central government, akin to existing localised housing accords, to agree shared priorities and areas of work for the whole country. Communication and interaction, covering factors such as ease of engagement, willingness to listen, and opportunities for people to have their say, came in at an average 32%. Business perceptions of local government were more negative than those of the general public, the poll found, with businesses wanting greater efforts to increase local economic opportunities, preferential access to procurement contracts, and better building and resource consent processes. The general public expressed greatest concern about trusting local government to make good spending decisions, provide good value for rates dollars spent, leadership by councillors, and strategies for prosperity and well-being. The poll found local government was more important with men than women, older people, ratepayers, business owners employing 6 or more people, and businesses involved in wholesale or retail distribution and transport. LGNZ also announced its intention to publish a thought leadership paper mid-year on regional transport links to ensure regional development and growth across all of New Zealand. Mr Ewell said in a statement, transport infrastructure is a critical component of regional economic success, and LGNZ is advocating for transport decision-making that underpins regional growth objectives. The initiative was partly motivated by the recent decision by Air New Zealand to stop serving some smaller regional centres.
NBR Radio, Tuesday the 19th. I'm John Stewart. I'm with Jason Walls, who's been covering a report by the New Zealand Initiative on charities. What did this report find, Jason?
Well, it was a very interesting report. I mean, anything that mentions the word charities usually sparks my interest. But this one was basically shining a light on New Zealand's charity sector, and it found that some 700 limited liability companies on the charities register generate more than $370 million of tax-exempt profits a year. So basically, the report was called The Giving Charities a Helping Hand, and it was put together by the New Zealand Initiative, and it kind of calculated that the government forgoes about $104 million of fiscal revenue every single year.
Have you seen this happening before?
Well, it's something that NBR has covered a little bit in the past. One of our other reporters, Campbell Gibson, broke the story earlier in this year around how the Christian charity Parachute Music were producing the backing music for X Factor.
Oh, that's right. I remember that.
And it was a very interesting story. And some of the sources that he was talking to said that Parachute were able to undercut competition from the other music production studios because of their tax exemption. So this is quite an interesting argument here. We also had a tax accountant from Staples Rodway called Mike Rudd tell us that it's not actually as simple as Parachute undercutting competition due to tax exemptions, but the charity could actually reduce costs in other ways. So what the report was saying, and it was I've been talking to a man called Jason Crump, and basically he was telling me that there's actually little oversight in how some of the cultural and religious charities spend some of the funds, simply because there's legislation that allows religious and cultural organizations, and what he said was essentially to get a free pass.
Any other culprits in this, apart from the ones you've mentioned?
Well, in the report, he mentioned quite a few different people that were involved. For example, New Zealand Swim were one of them. But one of the ones that he really drew my attention to was the Ngāi Tahu. And he said that they have roughly 38 business units, which are all registered charity, but none of them are actually paying any income tax. And he said, and I'm quoting him here, in our research, we found that the organization made $160 million in tax-free profits in 1 year, and only distributed about 20% of that to the charity. So that means that there's $140 million banging around in their balance sheets that's tax-free, and that has the potential to create unfair competitive landscape.
So how's this affecting some of the smaller charities?
Well, that was the other point on the report, because it also pointed to some of the unfair ways that it was stacked against some of the smaller businesses. So in the last 10 years, there's been a whole lot of change in regulation to do with charities. Basically what happens is that if you give to a registered charity, you get a 33% tax write-off, and they also get discounts on tax and things as well. So what happens after there was a big review of the legislation, and a lot of the charities were under review, and the regulators had to go back and look at them to see if they actually did have charitable status. And a lot of them were, what Mr. Crump was saying, was they were unfairly taken off this list. And what that looks like, I mean, it was for a lot of trivial reasons. And a lot of them, I mean, the high-profile ones and the ones that had enough resources were able to go to the Court of Appeal and appeal this decision, and it was eventually turned around. In fact, in one instance, they just said, well, this is the facts, and the Court of Appeal said, okay, they didn't do anything different from what the regulators did, but they said, okay, we're going to give you a charitable status back. But they were one of the lucky ones, because essentially a lot of the smaller charities within New Zealand don't have the resources to be able to take this up and hire things like lawyers. So he was telling me that often what happens is some of these charities just have to liquidate and just give all the money back to different charitable causes, because it looks, I mean, for starters, if you get taken off the charitable registers list, it looks really bad, despite the fact that you might not have done anything wrong.
Thanks very much for that, Jason.
NBR Radio with the Property Press. It's out now to show you around.
I'm Grant Walker with Last Call. Here's what's trending on NBR Online. Another downgrade for Cavalier as the CEO resigns. BBY not affected by parent collapse. The LGFA extends bonds to 2028. Consumer goes for Jetstar, and just what do you think of local government? To find out more on our stories, log on to nbr.co.nz or stay tuned. Those stories coming up next on NBR Radio.
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. I'm joined by Nathan Smith with his weekly Foreign Affairs scope. And today, Nathan, I think we go first to the Middle East to talk Iraq and ISIS, in particular the fall of Ramadi, a pretty strategic town.
Yeah, this is once again back in the Middle East. Yes, this is the centre of gravity at the moment for international relations. The partial fall of Ramadi. There are places now in that large city in the Anbar province that ISIS completely holds on its own. Shiite militias have been called in by Baghdad to reinforce soldiers. I believe 500 or so were killed over the past couple of days by a wave of VBID attacks and other suicide bombings before a massive counterattack happened with ISIS. So big fall, probably as large as Mosul a couple of months ago. But it just shows that once Tikrit falls to the central government, ISIS can then turn around and very publicly say, we're going to take another of your cities and there's nothing you can do to stop us. So this is just a tit for tat. There's a lot of narrative being pronounced over the airwaves at the moment about what this means and who's really in control of these sorts of places. Nevertheless, a town is now under control of ISIS that is very close to Baghdad.
Indeed, only just over 100 k's away, I think. Just while we're still on the Middle East, how effective are these Shiite militias?
The problem is not necessarily in their effectiveness. They are fighting for some of their core neighbourhoods, so they're tenacious. It's the fact that they are Shiite and they are fighting in Sunni areas, which is, from Baghdad's perspective, is exactly what they need. But from the rest of Iraq's cohesion and the long-term perspective, it doesn't really help. They haven't sorted out their issues, so to speak.
Now let's go to Russia and the Ukraine, and the US seems to be changing its tactics. In what way?
The US is now wishing to get a little bit more directly involved with some of the negotiations around the eastern parts of Ukraine and exactly what the status will be moving into the future. NATO has been involved in ways, but it's generally lent on Germany and France to do most of the negotiating. But it appears that a direct US hand is now needed as the pressure ramps up on Putin to come to some sort of conclusion about what he wants with this particular region. So we had a few high-level visits. Kerry was there recently, the Secretary of State, and also I can't remember her name, but a high-level diplomat in Europe also visited Putin recently. So, there's the US, I think, is realizing that it has a lot of pressure it can bring to bear on Russia, and this will just be an indicator of who's in control.
What sort of pressure, Nathan?
Well, currently, there's a lot of sanctions on Russia, but Russia is also moving into another recession. The oil prices are very low. Putin's still quite popular, but nevertheless, he, I think, feels a lot of pressure at home as well. And the US really don't have to put a lot of material or diplomatic resources into play on this, and they're in a much better position. And everything they do hurts Russia quite disproportionately.
Now let's go to Burundi in Africa, and there's some pretty disturbing unrest there. Just what's happening, Nathan?
A couple of days ago, it seems to have petered out, but there was an attempted coup. It seems to have come on the back of constitutional amendments by the president there, who tried to go for a third term or a second term. It's not quite clear what he exactly wanted, but he thought he had some constitutional authority to do that. The military didn't believe that was the case. The parliament also didn't believe that was the case, and there was some unrest. The problem, though, with that, which is why there's a lot of international diplomatic attention on this, is that back in 1994 there was a massive ethnic clash there with the Hutus and the Tutsis. But around the same time as what happened in Rwanda, most people assume that it was a Rwandan thing. It was actually a little bit larger than that. So there is potential for this to devolve heavily and quickly into ethnic potential genocide. So that's why people are noticing this and bringing this to the world attention.
Now to Yemen, which is heating up again. What's happening there?
The 5-day ceasefire is closed. Not much changed, really, but talks have begun. Problem is that the Houthis are not invited to this. They don't really respect the idea that the talks are being held in Saudi Arabia, as if Saudi Arabia has anything to do with Yemen in their minds. So they are completely not interested in talking amongst this particular framework. But it does leave them out in the cold necessarily. And therefore, since the ceasefire has ended, Saudi Arabia has restarted its airstrikes. Essentially, nothing changed over the week, and there are still positions that the Yemen needs to loosen up, and the Saudis are going to be doing this for them.
So still the bloodshed continues, and the poor old civilians are the ones who are suffering.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much for your Foreign Affairs Scope this week, Nathan.
You're listening to NBR Radio. Upgrade to My NBR Radio with a smartphone-only subscription to NBR Online today for free and receive unlimited access to NBR Online on your smartphone until August 31st. Visit www.nbr.co.nz/free.
To market news, Raycon shareholders will be eagerly awaiting tomorrow's annual results announcement after management promised the high-tech components manufacturer will be profitable this time around. The Auckland-based maker of quartz products and crystal components for GPS and telecommunications equipment, founded by director Warren Robinson in 1967 and listed in 2006, has suffered an earnings nosedive in recent years. However, Chairman Brian Mogridge assured disgruntled shareholders at its annual meeting last September the company would return to profitability by the end of the 2015 financial year. Raycon is forecasting underlying earnings before interest, tax, depreciation and amortisation of 10 to 15 million in the 12 months ending March 31st, 2015. First half results in the 6 months ending September 30 showed underlying EBITDA of 4.3 million, compared to an underlying loss of 4.7 million a year earlier. It reported a first half net loss of 3.4 million on revenue that fell 24%, although it narrowed its $45.7 million loss a year earlier. But Raycon expected higher profitability in the second half of the financial year to come from its telecommunications unit and its space and defence segment. Shareholders will be interested to hear how a number of strategic moves are working for the company. Raycon undertook a significant structural realignment over the past 18 months, including exiting the small-margin smart wireless device market to focus on the telecommunications sector and shifting manufacturing from UK and France to New Zealand and India. Although this meant more than 210 staff were either made redundant or not re-employed at a cost of $7.2 million, Raycon estimates this will save $12 million in operating expenses in 2015 and will position it to return to profit in time for second half results. Last December, it announced it's sold its Lincoln UK plant for £900,000, most of which will go towards repaying debt. Raycon focused on reducing its bank borrowings as part of its restructure and had net debt of $8.2 million as at September 30, down from $27.1 million a year earlier. The company received a profile boost last November after the Rosetta spacecraft, which Raycon supplied crystal filters and oscillators, completed its 10-year, 1.6 billion kilometre journey to land on a 4-kilometre wide comet. Raycon's share price is at 35 cents today, having increased 1.4% since the start of the year and 67% over the past 12 months, largely on the announcement a return to profit was imminent. In a business update, several early shareholders in the healthcare company TruScreen sold down their holdings within days of the company listing last November, trading records show. TruScreen, a marketer of cancer screening technology acquired from defunct Australian company Polytechnics, announced a capital raising on Wednesday to fund growth plans in Asia. The scheme aims to raise 3 to 4 million from share issues through a private placement and a share purchase plan. The company also raised 6.5 million from private investors at 10 cents a share before its listing, among them former Telecom chief executive Teresa Gatting, property investor Chris Francis, Unison Networks director Brendan Hall and former stockbroker Brett Wilkinson. On its November 12 NZAX debut, TruScreen shares opened at 16 cents amid a flurry of trading, offering early investors a stag opportunity. Share trading records show Mr. Francis began selling stock on November 14 and over the next month sold about 500,000 shares, about half of his holding. Ms. Gatting began selling on November 17 and also sold 500,000 shares, about 40% of her holding. On April 30, TruScreen announced it had received approval from China's Food and Drug Administration to market its cervical cancer screening product there. TrueScreen Chief Executive Martin Dillon described the development as a very significant commercial opportunity for the company. In a spike in trading volumes after the announcement, there were further sales from early shareholders. Between May 1 and 8, Mr Hall sold down about 500,000 shares in a series of trades, the smallest comprising just 27 shares. Mr Wilkinson was also a seller, offloading about 100,000 shares of his initial 650,000 holding that week in trades as small as 15 shares. One experienced market source said it would be not unusual for pre-listing investors to sell down. He said, "I'd say it's not abnormal. If it's just an individual who provided IPO capital, it's certainly not unusual for them to want to take out some of their holding." A TrueScreen investor who asked not to be named said he had confidence in the company and would participate in the capital raising. He said, "If I didn't believe in this, I could have sold all my shares a week ago. The market's been there to clean out."
NBR Radio, Wednesday the 20th. I'm John Stewart. I'm here with court reporter Victoria Young, who has the latest in a case between former Allied Farmers boss Rob Allaway and his former fiancée Jane Bond. Victoria, what's this case about?
Well, our NBR member subscribers will remember Mr Allaway, a key figure in persuading former Hanover and United Finance investors to partake in a controversial Allied Farmers debt for equity swap back in 2009. But Mr Allaway has popped up in the media again because he split with his fiancée Jane Bond more than 2 years ago, and they are fighting in the High Court over property. Now it had included a $45,000 engagement ring, which we found out yesterday Ms Bond has now sold, but it also includes an iPad, an iPhone, various chattels worth about $55,000 and a couple of Louis Vuitton purses.
So what's happened so far?
Well, it's quite a legally interesting case as well because he's using the Domestic Actions Act, which is different from the relationship property sort of legislation because it's specifically about engagements. What I learned about this act, which I hadn't realised before, that you can use this act if you're engaged to someone to basically get everything back if the engagement doesn't follow through. And he's had an initial victory on this part of the legislation. I think it was a couple of months ago, Justice Ed Wiley said, yes, this domestic actions case could continue in the High Court.
Right. So what happened yesterday, Tuesday?
Yes, now, yesterday, Mr Allaway, who's representing himself, I might add, came before Justice Kit Toogood in the Auckland High Court. He said that he wants freezing orders over these various property items. Ms Bond, who has been represented by Ms Moira Maccabee, she said she wants the court proceedings transferred to the family court, or at least to the district court. Basically, she says it's not complex enough for a High Court hearing, whereas Mr Allaway says, no, it's convoluted and it's complicated, and he wants a higher court to hear this case.
And I guess in the other courts, like the family court, there'd be lower costs.
Yes, that's right, and that's what Ms Bond wants, especially as she's on a benefit at the moment, and this discovery and stuff is really wearing actually both parties out in this matter.
What did the judge say?
Well, the judge has reserved his official decision on the case, but he sort of did indicate during the hearing, what he said to Mr Allaway was that he needed to come to the terms with the fact that it would be unusual for the High Court to hear the case. He said, and I quote, "You need to take it from me, and don't get me wrong because I know it's important to you, but these matters are well outside the High Court's usual business."
Well, that's being pretty direct, I guess. Mr Allaway also made some remarks concerning the media. Can you tell me about those?
Yes, so this case has been interesting because Mr Allaway has refused to comment at all to NBR Online, but during the hearing he asked the court to make directions to either censure or caution the media from reporting the case. And he sort of referenced a Sunday Star Times article which had reported on the case and reported comments made by Ms Bond. However, what Justice Toogood said was, well, I'm sorry, you came to the High Court and this doesn't have the privacy and protection of the family court. And he also said, it's too late, there's too much information already in the public domain. Ms Bond's lawyer did have a response to this. She said that everything that her client has told the media is lawful and doesn't breach any statutes. And the judge, I mean, he wasn't actually interested in arguing this. I think what the judge said was, my impression is that while he is addressing me, he is really addressing somebody else in the room. Now, I was the media there, and Ms. Bond was also sitting at the back of the court, so I guess it was a bit of a veiled threat from Mr. Allaway on what he wanted to say to the media or talking to the media without actually saying anything to us.
And also maybe sending a message to Ms. Bond. Yes,
exactly. And so, Justice Toogood said, Mr. Allaway, you are familiar with being in the public eye, so we won't muzzle the news media, and, you can have a remedy in defamation if he wants to.
Indeed. So just one very last quick question, Victoria. Is Mr. Allaway still with Allied Farmers?
No, he's not. He left I think he got quite a substantial amount of money when he left less than a year from when he joined. So, he was in and out of there quite quickly. And what he does now is he works for a Chinese import-export company, I think.
Oh, right.
So quite a different business.
Yet he's told the court that he can't afford a fridge in his own kitchen. So go figure.
Yes, very interesting.
Thanks very much for that, Victoria.
Thanks, John.
NBR. Need to hire? Try our online recruitment platform, www.nbrtalent.co.nz.
Budget time used to be for filling up the car, buying stockpiles of cigarettes and getting an extra crate of beer. Those days are over, and new taxes are no longer passed by urgency in Parliament. In his Editor's Insight on Wednesday, Neville Gibson looks at the future for oil prices. Neville, petrol prices seem to be on the way up again. Would that be right?
They are, but there are occasional drops, and there's been discounting ahead of weekends. You can get it on Thursday, but it's still a highly competitive and price-sensitive market. Now, the total tax on petrol is around about 40% of the pump price, and that's around about $2 for standard, according to AA's Petrol Watch, which you can track things there. And politically, there's always a bit of agitation about petrol prices. People are calling for inquiries, but these are focused on the smallest component of the petrol price. That's the oil companies' retailers' margins. But not surprisingly, if any inquiry is held, and one was recently sponsored by Z Energy, these show there are no excessive profits being made, and the AA seems to agree. But unfortunately, the big drop in petrol prices, which has underlined deflationary pressures in the economies all around the world, looks like being far from being in the normal situation.
Right. So what are the pundits saying about future prices?
Well, petrol prices have actually come up about 40% since their lows earlier this year, and the forecasts show rather a mixed outlook, but it's one that increasingly looks a bit like a W, and we're about halfway through. We're at the middle tip when prices could drop substantially again before rising. Now, if you look at the futures trading in America, and they go through to July at the moment, you're looking at around $65 a barrel. That's in the Brent crude, and US prices tend to be a little bit lower than that.
Does everyone agree about the future direction of prices, though?
Well, a column in the Wall Street Journal has been surveying some analysts' forecasts, and they point to an average of $63 a barrel for crude going through to September. So that means the prices are coming down a bit. But in that range of economists, you had Bank of America, Merrill Lynch saying they could be below $60 for the rest of the year. And other banks, Standard Chartered being one of them, they say there could be a rebound up to as high as $90 by the end of the year. But a lot of this is contingent on the slowing oil boom in the US. As the price goes up, shale oil production goes down. But the general consensus is that the global market is still oversupplied, and in Russia and Saudi Arabia, who are highly dependent on oil revenues, they've both cranked up production, and it's now at its highest, historically speaking.
The impact of shale oil reserves in the US has had a big impact on price, but is that continuing?
Well, it certainly has had quite a bit. You hear about oil drilling rig numbers, that sort of thing. But when oil gets to about $70 a barrel, which it nearly did just recently, the producers have an incentive to bring back a lot of supply. It's actually quite an expensive form of oil production, although it led to that big drop from well over $100 that we saw last year. Now, the forecasters say that the price next year could be even lower, so they are looking a bit further forward. But of course, that's a pretty murky set of predictions there. But summarised, we could say that fewer are expecting a strong recovery in prices, and that production is well able to meet the demand, and that demand goes up in the second half of the year, which maybe, who knows? I'm not going to make any firm prediction here.
Right. Now, and finally, to just broaden the discussion out a bit, the IMF has produced a report on the true costs of fossil fuel. Is this likely to have an impact on prices?
Well, this report has landed a bit like a bomb in the middle of all this. The report's authors describe their report as shocking. It's a bit of an understatement, because they say that consumers of all energy, and we're talking about fossil fuels here, not just oil but coal and that sort of thing, for use in electricity and transportation, they are saying that consumers around the world are paying, that are being subsidised for the true costs of all this to the tune of $5.3 trillion a year. Now, it points a finger at the use of coal in China and India, and it says these costs are mainly aimed at poor air quality, pollution of land and water, and the impact on health. In fact, the authors of this report say that this $5.3 trillion exceeds the total spent around the world on healthcare.
Neville, thanks very much for your editor's insight today.
NBR Radio with Hotel de Brett, partying since 1959. www.hoteldebret.com. NBR Radio.
In business news, the New Zealand arm of one of Australia's biggest broking firms, BBY, says it isn't directly affected by the collapse of its parent. New Zealand Chief Executive Brent Wienek says the local operations aren't part of the administration of the Australian firm, which appointed KPMG as administrators earlier this week after it reportedly was unable to raise additional capital. The failure to raise capital, reportedly it needed between 2 to 3 million to continue operating, meant the firm was suspended from trading by the stock exchange operator ASX. Mr. Wienek says the situation will have an impact on the New Zealand arm and its clients, but exactly what is unclear yet. Mr. Wienek says, we're monitoring and watching the situation in Australia closely and will be assessing the effects on us and our clients. BBY has offices in Auckland and Wellington and 12 personnel in this country. Mr. Wienek says his firm, which isn't an NZX participant, has relationships with other local stockbrokers. ABC News is reporting that thousands of investors in Australia are bracing themselves for widespread losses, and that third-party stockbrokers who used BBY to clear trades have been left millions of dollars out of pocket, and that their clients' funds are potentially at risk. However, Mr. Wienek says the New Zealand arm doesn't handle any clients' funds. He says we're a very small advisory function of the larger group. BBY's website says it has more than $2 billion in assets under management and a wealth of Australian and international clients. It says BBY, established in 1987, has completed more than $7 billion worth of capital raisings and is one of the fastest growing full-service stockbroking houses in Australia and New Zealand, turning over $2.4 billion in ASX equities a month. Earlier this month, BBY suspended its options trading operations, with the executive chairman Glenn Rosewall saying in a statement that part of the business had grown too quickly and it was facing pressure to ensure its clients' exposures were properly covered. To the IT market, local firms top the latest table of IT services company revenue compiled by IDC. Wellington-based Datacom, majority owned by NBR Rich-listed John Holdsworth, leapfrogged Spark's IT services division Spark Digital into first place in the new rankings. Last year, Datacom reported revenue that edged up 1.3% to $881 million, as its sales in Australia and Asia fell 8.6% to $415 million, but its New Zealand turnover rose 12% to $466 million. Staff numbers rose 6% over the year to 3,756. Pre-tax profit was up 27% to $64.7 million. For For the first half of 2015, Spark reported a 3.3% decline in Spark digital revenue to $622 million and a 5.7% fall in EBITDA to $182 million. For the 2014 full financial year, Spark Digital reported a 1.5% decline in revenue to $1.29 billion and a 0.7% fall in EBITDA to $399 million. IDC's survey excludes business process outsourcing and consulting revenue. Let's talk immigration. Labor's Grant Robertson argues the point-based migration policy will not work unless more opportunities are created in the regions. Labor's finance spokesman told NBR Radio the points-based migration system is just the first step, and for the idea to succeed, a partnership between regional government, businesses and central government needs to be formed. He says this will help develop work opportunities in the regions, and unless this is done, the migration policy won't work. Mr. Robertson says, I think the critical point is the point-based system can't just be the only policy response. What we need is a regional development that actually encourages people to go there. This includes an integrated regional development policy that includes improving job opportunities and infrastructure. This comes after Mr. Robertson outlined the point-based migration system earlier this month. The meat and potatoes of the idea is to award skilled migrants more points if they're willing to settle in a region rather than Auckland. Martin Jenkins, senior consultant and regional economic growth expert Jason Lengwai, says he's supportive of the idea. He says there's huge demand for skilled labour in the regions. There's a lot of depopulation in regions where they struggle to attract people. He says it's an approach that most regions would be quite keen on, and if migrants with skills were given incentives to settle in regions lacking in a skill, they would add value. Immigration Minister Michael Woodhouse has come out in support of the idea, telling TV3's The Nation the system could be implemented in a few months. Although he agrees with the idea, he was hesitant to support the notion that high levels of immigration are contributing to Auckland's housing issues. But Mr. Robertson disagrees and says people living in Auckland know that the place is bursting at the seams. He said continued migration at the levels we've seen in Auckland have pushed up house prices, which has put more pressure on infrastructure. It would seem the stars have aligned in this debate, with National and Labour agreeing and NBR poll participants giving it the nod. An overwhelming 82% of participants agreed there should be a point-based system for potential immigrants to reward those who pledged to settle outside Auckland, leaving just 18% who disagreed.
NBR. With a National Business Review smartphone subscription, you can read or listen to the latest from NBR online. And for a limited time, it's free. Join NBR's Intelligent Business Network today and get free smartphone access to NBR online until August 31st. NBR doesn't do sport, weather or horoscopes, just timely, relevant, useful and insightful business news. So for business news you can use for free, visit nbr.co.nz/free.